delighted to have you all here today. My name is Neil Fulton, and I am the CPC's Chief Delivery Officer. Just in case you're not aware, CPC, one of 9 Catapult centres in the UK, each with the remit of growing the UK economy and creating UK jobs in their respective fields. So our success is based on the success of the organisations we work with. We've got about 230 people. Most of those are involved in projects relating to research and development of technologies, breaking down barriers in the mobility and built environment markets. And we do that in collaboration. So we do that with companies large and small, and with government and with academia. So we work with public bodies, businesses and infrastructure providers to catalyze a step change improvement in the way people live, work and travel. And we connect businesses and public sector leaders to cutting edge research to spark innovation and grow new markets. We run technology demonstrators and SME accelerators to scale new solutions that drive growth and spread prosperity. So just to be clear, today's event is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. And should you have any trouble with connectivity, the link is on CPC's events page. So at this point, we normally run a poll to get an understanding of the audience. So if you could tick the appropriate box, that would be really great. Thank you very much. And while we're waiting for the answers from the poll, I'll just mention that we will be launching the next chapter of the innovation brief, Net Zero Places, next week, where you can find some insight and analysis from domain experts across Connected Places Catapult, covering examples of pioneering practice, dispatches from the leading edge of research, and a showcase of brilliant British businesses with net zero propositions for places. So whether you're looking for ideas on how to deliver net zero commitments in your area or organization, or an innovator seeking opportunities for collaboration and commercial contracts, this innovation brief will connect you to the insights you need to take action. The brief will be launched on the 1st of December. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce, before I do that, let's just have a quick look at the poll results that are coming out. So first time, 67%, that's great, fantastic, and welcome, and new faces, we're really pleased to see that, so thank you. And what sector are you from? Quite a few here from local government, a handful from academia, some consultants, nobody from media, press or publishing, some people from the mobility world, and a few SMEs and startups. Really great. Thank you very much for the feedback there. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce our 3 speakers today. Firstly, Dame Sarah Storey, Paralympian and Sheffield City Region Active Travel Commissioner, with a total of 14 Paralympic and 38 world titles to her name. Sarah Storey is one of the most decorated athletes in British sporting history. As a lifelong advocate of the physical and mental health benefits of cycling, and I noticed on your Twitter feed from Sunday, by the way, that huge smile on your face, having cycled 70 miles to deliver a Christmas present, this must be true. Also a vocal champion of accessible infrastructure and an inspirational figure in encouraging more women to take up increased levels of physical activity. She was selected to spearhead Sheffield City Region's active travel agenda. Sarah, would you like to add anything to that, and any thoughts you might have indeed for today's event?
Oh, thank you very much, Neil. It's a great honour to be a part of the event. Thank you for inviting me. I've been involved in sport my entire life, and I got more into the active travel aspects of sport when British Cycling had me working in their policy team alongside Chris Boardman, who's the policy advisor. I've been working as a policy advocate, and that led on to me taking the role in Sheffield City Region, working for the mayor there, Dan Jarvis. And it's something that I feel really passionate about. I kind of don't realise just how active our lives are when you walk or cycle everywhere, and you only use the car when you absolutely have to. I live in the beautiful countryside, so being able to enable that for more people and give them the opportunity to be more active is something that I really feel strongly we should all be able to do. And we got a taste for what life might be like if the traffic levels return to the levels of the 1950s, but it took an extreme situation for that to take place. So being able to work towards a place where it's easier to walk and cycle is something that is very much something I enjoy being a part of. So it's an honour to be part of the panel, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sarah. Moving on to Rachel Aldred, Professor of Transport at the University of Westminster and Director of the Active Travel Academy. Rachel has 10 years experience of researching active travel and has made contributions to the field in areas including conceptualizing and calculating active travel potential, developing methods for evaluation research, near-miss studies, applying epidemiological methods to active travel injury risk, and exploring cultures of active travel, including processes of stigmatization and marginalization. Rachel, could I ask you for any initial comments you have ahead of today's Q&A?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Neil. And I'm really pleased to be here as well. So I was just reflecting on some of those issues that Sarah was mentioning that we talked about earlier. And I was thinking one of the things that drives me is my background in social science. So I'm not a transport engineer or whatever by background. I'm a sociologist. And I got really interested in this area because I got intrigued by the way that people behave in public space when they're driving, walking, cycling and so on, and the way in which we encounter each other in public space and the way in which behaviours, attitudes and so on change. And one of the things that I thought was really fascinating was the way in which public discourse, the way in which we talk about transport shapes how we spend, how we behave, our attitudes and so on. So one example that is that traditionally we talk about investing in roads and we talk about subsidising public transport. And so there's a suggestion that roads bring economic benefits and public transport is just money down the drain, when if anything it's the other way round. So I'm really excited to be here, and I'm really excited to answer the questions and to talk about potentially some of the work that I'm doing at the moment around looking at evidence, looking at current temporary schemes and so on. And I'm really keen that the schemes that are going in at the moment, the temporary cycle lanes, the low traffic neighbourhoods, the school streets and so on, are evaluated, are studied, stayed long enough to be evaluated and studied, so that we can learn from them and we can draw some conclusions from the very, relatively speaking, fast changes that have been happening.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Rachel, and welcome. So last but not least, Tom McPhail, Director of Public Affairs at Pure Electric. So Tom is spokesman for Pure Electric, a very fast growing retail business selling electric bicycles, cargo bikes and electric scooters. The company was started 2 years ago by entrepreneur Adam Norris, who wanted to use technology to address the climate challenge and improve people's lives. Tom's background lies mainly in financial services, politics and media engagement, having spent 20 years leading the public affairs work for FTSE 100 business Hargreave Lansdown. He now does similar work for Pure Electric, but on bikes and scooters, which are much more fun than pensions. Tom, would you like to share any immediate thoughts you have with today's attendees? You're on mute, Tom.
Yeah, that is the refrain for 2020, isn't it? Thank you, Neil. So can I just add to that, I also have a bike problem, and I am a passionate cyclist and really, really enjoy cycling. It's ironic, I don't have an e-bike. However, I work for a business that only sells e-bikes and electric scooters. I do see this technology as having the potential to transform so many aspects of our lives. And I think this moment right now is just so exciting. We've already had mention of the low traffic neighborhoods and the work going on there. The potential for this technology, whether it's conventional bicycles or e-bikes, to change people's health trajectories, to address the climate change challenge, the staggering weight of carbon dioxide we're pumping into the atmosphere every year. We've also already touched on the question of government policy weighted between cars and active travel. And I think, for a long time, we've got away with not thinking about the literally millions of tons of carbon dioxide we're pumping into the atmosphere every year. We've got away with not thinking about the tens of thousands of people that die in this country every year as a result of poor air quality and the impact that poor physical health has on morbidity and mortality, and the fact that physical inactivity causes as much harm as smoking still in this country. So, and there is this moment right now this year when we can change so much of that. And there is this feeling that the Overton window, the public policy agenda, is shifting right now. That we have this opportunity to capitalize on all these moments and to really embed gains that will change all of those things that I've talked about. So it is enormously exciting to be involved in all of that.
Couldn't agree more, Tom. Thanks for your thoughts there. Okay, so in terms of the Q&As, the format here is that I'll ask a few questions of the speakers, to get things started, and then we'll start taking questions from the audience. So if you do have questions, then please start adding them to the Q&As at the bottom of the screen, and I'll try my best to pick out the best or maybe the most difficult ones for our speakers to answer. Okay, so without any more ado, if Sarah, if you could bring your video on, thank you very much. And I shall make a start on the first question that I have. And I'm going to start with you, Sarah, if that's okay, because I read in July this year the government's vision for cycling and walking. It was their document forward by the Prime Minister called Gear Change. And it's their wonderful, in my view, vision for cycling and walking, a huge £4 billion investment over 5 years to transform towns and cities, really, establishing an inspectorate, Active Travel England, and a national cycling and walking commissioner. Now, I don't know about you, this seems to have gone quite quiet from my point of view. Maybe a global pandemic has taken the headlines, but what was your reaction to this news and what could it mean for cities like Sheffield?
Well, we were delighted at Sheffield City Region to, see this document. I think it was delayed. It was initially going to be produced for before it was in July, but when it finally came out, we weren't disappointed with the content. And it was content that we'd been working on within the region anyway. When the mayor appointed me to lead the programme, he wanted to have a very definite direction on how we were going to put active travel at the heart of our public transport system, make sure that people had access to walking and cycling as a first choice for short journeys. And so that document now lays out that opportunity for the whole country. So it's incredibly welcome. I like to think they might have stolen some of our ideas as well, perhaps, which is always good. But it's really important that we start to look at raising the standards of infrastructure, because we've been having a very piecemeal approach over the past number of years, 30, 40, 50 years. We've been prioritising motor vehicles, and it's become all too convenient to make every single journey in a vehicle. And as we know from what Tom said, it's causing ill health, it's causing premature death, and it's something that definitely needs to be addressed. And I think you're right, it has gone a little bit quiet, but I think the second wave is starting to create some issues. Yesterday, the funding review wasn't as we could have hoped for, perhaps, but maybe it's not unexpected given how much spending's been there. But we really need to address this difference between what we perceive to be spending on our roads and what we perceive to be spending on active travel. And for me, active travel is part of our roads. All sorts of different types of people and vehicles use roads. And so that roads budget shouldn't just be ring fenced for motorised vehicles. It should be for all types of journeys that are made on the public highway. And I think that's the key. It's the public highway. It's not funded through this fictitious road tax that is sometimes thrown out the vehicle windows at you. It's funded through general taxation, through everybody's contributions to that. And so therefore everybody should be able to access that safely. And when you look at the journeys of children to school, of the elderly, of people who don't have access to a vehicle, and how many people in the country and how many households don't have access to a vehicle, it makes it even more stark why we need to start looking at funding our roads for the public and for the people that are using them, and not just for one mode of transport.
Couldn't agree more. Wow. Okay, so thank you. And actually, Rachel, from your point of view and from a academic or research point of view, what did that news of gear change mean for the universities at large?
The gear change document itself, I think, was really very exciting, and there were a number of things that, for instance, the updated cycling, in particular, it was focused around cycling, but the updated design guidance, where we were talking about, for instance, an assumption that people on bikes were not necessarily on two-wheeled bikes. People might be using a range of bikes. A lot of just a whole load of images used, which showed that, you know, cycling was being thought about in a much more accessible, a much more diverse manner. So that was very exciting, and I think that some of those signals, the promise of Active Travel England, you know, like Sarah, you know, it's kind of disappointing that doesn't seem to be in place, because I think one of the things that local authorities would really have done with, as they implement, particularly ones that don't have a tradition of implementing modal filters, bike lanes and so on, if there was some kind of national body, some advisory body just to help them along the way, I think that would have made a really big difference. And I would like to see Active Travel England in place quickly, because I think a national body of expertise to support local authorities is really important. They've had so much in the way of cuts, they're struggling, they've been coping with coronavirus, so I think they really do need extra support, extra funding, but also extra expertise and advice.
Thank you, Rachel. Tom, what from an SME's point of view, what does an announcement like gear change mean for you or for other organisations in the UK?
There's a couple of things there, Neil. So there's the contextual change, the impetus towards the infrastructure, the kind of things that address people's concerns about active travel. You know, we know women particularly feel less confident often about cycling on the roads. So creating an environment where they can cycle safely is critical. And I think, you know, that's huge. I've been, you know, it was fantastic seeing all that temporary infrastructure, all the pop-up lanes appear over the summer. And then you see the gear change document, and there's a message from the government that, you know, we're going to push ahead with this. And it's actually been quite encouraging to see the Department for Transport pushing back on some of the opposition to the low traffic neighbourhoods. You know, not everybody likes them. Some people are complaining about them. Some MPs are complaining about them. And so far, the Department for Transport's been pretty good at pushing back on those complaints, to say, look, no, sorry, this is happening, deal with it, kind of thing. So that contextual change, that environmental change around the culture of cycling and what the central government is doing is fantastic. It was great to see them. It was only a paragraph, but they flagged up in the document as well the intention to subsidise e-bikes. And as I mentioned in the introduction, I don't feel a need to ride an e-bike just now. I was out on my bike earlier on, and a guy passed me on an e-bike, and that's fine. You know, he's doing his thing. The point is, it acts as a bridge for a lot of people. It gets people who wouldn't otherwise cycle out on bikes. It flattens hills, they go further, they get a lot of the physiological benefits of conventional bikes. So I think it's fantastic that the government's looking to support that. You know, they've really kind of neglected that area hitherto. I think the challenge, you know, we've already touched on the funding issues. The challenge is that there's a naught missing on a lot of this funding stuff. You know, they need to pump so much more money in to transform towns and cities up and down the country, and they need to work with local authorities up and down the country. I get a sense that it's coming. We've just got to not let up. You know, we've got to keep that going. We've got to keep the pressure on. And of course, you know, we saw the Chancellor's statement yesterday. Things are not good. So it's easy for the government to start cutting corners if we let them. We have to keep that pressure on. So really exciting, really positive. Just one other thing I want to flag up, which also came out this summer, was the LTN 120, the local transport notes around infrastructure design. And I think there was a lot of really good stuff in there as well. I mean, just little things like people who are designing cycling infrastructure have to cycle themselves. You know, you've got to go and experience it for yourself. How many times have we seen cycle lanes that stop with a tree or just cast cyclists out into the middle of a dual carriageway. You wouldn't do that if you were a cyclist. And I think that kind of changed, with that starting to learn from abroad, all the good stuff we've seen in Northern Europe hitherto. So lots to be excited about, but no let up.
Thank you, Tom. You've covered a lot of ground there. And there's a couple of things that I think we're going to come back to, especially on things like hills and e-bikes, and maybe we'll come back to that next. But also, I think you mentioned, or there's been some mention already of cargo bikes, and I want to come back to that as well. But if we can just stay on the subject of spending review just for a little bit longer, and maybe a bit about government policy, and just trying to digest some of the details of the spending review. The 257 million set aside for active travel in 2021 is less than 1% of the 27 billion pound roads budget. And my question really, having been absorbed into this world for some time now, Sarah, is that sort of money sufficient to ensure active travel achieves its ambition?
Well, we could always do with more, but we're not going to turn down what we can get. And I think it's just about having a change of perception, as I said before, about what our roads are for, who they're for, and how we can effectively spend the money that's there. So now there's also that opportunity for councils, mayoral combined authorities, and the devolved nations to look at how they provide for people within their region, and to show that they understand the population, how they're moving around. So yeah, it's disappointing not to have more. It's perhaps understandable why, but we have to. We won't be turning it down. We'll be taking every penny and maximising it. It's the most cost-effective way of reducing pollution, improving health, reducing the cost of the NHS, and in the long run, it's that silver bullet for so many of the ills across society. So we do need to see an improvement there, but we also need to see a perception change, and it's that concept that there's somehow a war on motorists because people wanted to implement low traffic neighbourhoods. Well, we're supporting motorists by providing 27 billion. That actually had to be said, and I think that's one thing that we need to realise is a minority of very vocal voices, but when you talk to the majority of people, they're incredibly supportive for building activity back into people's lives, and that's what it's about the the everyday lives of people who just want to be able to move around with ease without having to negotiate cars parked on pavements, which is a big issue outside of London, and to be able to get out of their house if they have a disability, and actually allowing people to speak for themselves. One thing we've noticed is that everybody has a story about a disabled person who's trapped, but the disabled person hasn't been allowed to speak for themselves about how they would like their future to be. And that whole concept of, does he take sugar? Well, let's let that person speak and talk about their challenges and come up with a solution that isn't just vehicle based, because most disabled people would like to have the option of fresh air as well. It doesn't just mean that they're going to be collected in a vehicle and taken somewhere. It means that they want to have that independence too. So we need to allow that conversation to diversify and get as many different voices in there to plan what neighbourhoods need for those people that live there.
Absolutely. And in fact, Rachel, on that topic of low traffic neighbourhoods, it's received a lot of media attention, as we've just discussed, often for being particularly contentious. What does your research tell us about this?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, first of all, that any kind of measure that restricts the ability to get around by car or to park one's car tends to be quite controversial. So in a sense, it's not that surprising. This is, these kind of measures are controversial whenever and wherever, but certainly they have been controversial. And I think one of the things that's interesting with our research is that we've been able to look at low traffic neighbourhoods that were implemented in Waltham Forest, because these things haven't been put in that many places until recently. But in Waltham Forest, as part of the Millie Holland schemes, which we were studying anyway, they were going in from about 2016. So we can look at some of the impacts, and we've got a range of research actually underway at the moment. But one of the first things we did was look at the impact on physical activity and car use, walking, cycling, active travel, and car use, based on a survey sample that we already had. And we found that we already knew that Millie Holland interventions, walking, cycling type interventions, meant that people walked and cycled more, on average around 40 to 45 45 minutes a week. But we found that in the low traffic neighbourhood areas, that was even greater. So that gave an additional boost to walking and cycling. But also what was interesting, and what's now being confirmed by some more research we've done using administrative data, is that car use and car ownership are declining in those low traffic neighbourhood areas. So it seems like, and in a sense, that's not surprising. Transport planners know that you have to have a carrot and stick approach. So you have to make walking and cycling a bit better, a bit more easier, a bit safer, and you have to make driving that bit more inconvenient, that bit more difficult. And low traffic neighbourhoods seem to be doing that effectively. And the fact that we can see a reduction in car ownership actually with some of the DVLA data, the car ownership registration data that we're now finding, is really interesting, because it's not just that people are using their car less, it's actually that they're maybe getting rid of their cars or possibly not buying one when they would have done so otherwise. So this is really encouraging.
Great, thank you. So a couple of questions now, which I'm going to point towards Tom and Sarah. I mean, Sheffield, known for its hills, and with this in mind, but I suspect actually this applies to lots and lots of places. Sometimes you don't need big hills to create, challenges for people who might want to do more commuting. Even if there are significant gradients, it changes the way people, commute on whether they can or cannot commute on a cycle. But with that in mind, do you see what sort of opportunity do you see for the whole e-bike revolution and maybe e-cargo bikes as well in the next few years? And Tom, from your point of view, clearly you've got a certain angle on this with your company. But I also, would like to hear more about, your thoughts about where that might go, and then we'll come over to you, Sarah, for your views on it, please.
Thanks, Neil. I think the thing that I find intriguing is let's start with the cargo bikes, because my perception, I mean, obviously delivery companies, small businesses, there's an obvious synergy there, and sort of replacing fleets of urban delivery vans is there's an obvious market there. In the shorter term, we think there's actually a bigger market in the domestic use for cargo bikes. And you think of urban or semi-urban households that currently have 2 cars, that might have a young family. And if you can, and cargo bikes are not cheap, by the way. I mean, you're starting at a couple of £1,000. You can easily sort of rack up £4,000 or £5,000 on a cargo bike. So it is definitely a considered purchase. You're not going to go and buy one of these on a whim. But if it means you can get rid of a second car, and what's the resale value of a second car? Let's say you get £2,000 for your second car, and you go and sell that. The average running cost of a car, typical car, add in fuel, insurance, road tax, all the rest of it, servicing, it's about £160 a month. It's typical cost of running a car, right? So you get rid of the car, and within a year or so, placing with a cargo bike, it's paid for itself. And that means, you may be still running one car, but as a family, you're now using a cargo bike, maybe if you're doing the school run, maybe if you're going to the supermarket, maybe if you're just going into town and just doing jobs, right? I think that kind of market is really exciting. And so, cargo bikes, for the small businesses, but not just for the small businesses. And I think the potential there is huge. I'll pause there. I'll let Sarah come in.
No, I agree. I think it's not just kind of confined. It doesn't have to just be a hilly place. We have an e-bike now for my mum, so she can keep up with our 3-year-old, just on a gentle gradient, say in Chatsworth Park or somewhere like that. So I think they can be used for everybody. And it's really important that we talk about them just being there for utility reasons. And as Tom says, to be able to replace a second vehicle with one of those would be absolutely brilliant. But also get into the idea that they could very well be used by small businesses for deliveries, last mile deliveries, enabling people to build activity into the lives of their workforce. Because if you're driving around delivering parcels all day, you're on a strict schedule, and we're trying to implement active neighbourhoods, which means modal filters. It means you park in a vehicle outside of that neighbourhood and utilising an active means to deliver within that neighbourhood. So not only are you building activity into the life of your employee, but you're also making sure that you're not polluting the place that you're delivering to, and you're creating a much better environment for everybody. So I think there's so many uses for these cargo bikes, e-bikes, e-cargo bikes, e-trikes, recumbent e-trikes like ice trikes, and they open up a whole new world for people with mobility issues and disability, and create an opportunity for everybody to have access to something that that should be for everybody. It shouldn't just be that if you can only ride a two-wheel bike and have the balance for that you're excluded. All of these other wonderful machines enable us to open up that world to everybody.
Sorry, Neil, let me just come back in on that, if
Please,
I may.
yeah.
So I think away from the cargo bikes, I think it's interesting that certainly for a lot of this year, the bike we were selling the most of was a bike called a G-Tech, which is it's not the most beautiful bike in the world. It doesn't have a rack on the back. It doesn't even have a computer. Like a lot of them have a little sort of control panel on the handlebars. It doesn't even have one of those, but it's cheap. It's just about the cheapest e-bike you can buy, a bit under £1,000. A lot of people were buying those because it's a commuter bike. It's just a way to get from A to B. And I think a lot of the time in this country, the word cyclist conjures up it's like middle-aged blokes, sort of ripping around the place in lycra, and it's not a pretty sight. But cyclists in other countries are just people who use bikes to get from A to B, and we need a bit more of that. And I'm really excited at the prospect of just getting people, whether it's in Sheffield or in Bristol or in London or wherever, just going into work on a bike, and it's just a mode of transport. It just gets you from A to B, and it's simple and it's easy. And I think that's a really exciting prospect.
So while we're on this topic, then, and I'd be interested to hear thoughts really from you, Tom, but also you, Rachel, on the perspective of, you're an innovative retailer focused on e-mobility. You must have to watch those trends quite closely and see what's happening in the UK, but also understand how it's happened in other countries. And obviously, I went to Copenhagen a few years ago, and it is just incredible. So the use of cargo bikes, not even e-cargo bikes, just cargo bikes generally, was really amazing. And what they were being used for, just some of them generally for commuting and putting a bag in the front, but also carrying the children, carrying other stuff. And I think, it'd be interesting to hear how we think that might change over time. So Tom, briefly from you on that, what do you keep an eye on those trends?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Still personal anecdote, hiking in the Dolomites a couple of years ago, all of a sudden, all the mountain bikes were e-bikes. Okay, that's a thing. Hadn't seen that before. And actually now here in the UK, increasingly, walking out on Pen y Fan earlier this year when we were allowed to still, and all of a sudden, all the mountain bikers, they're on e-bikes. Okay, so we're several years behind. And you look at sales of e-bikes across Germany, Denmark, and Holland and France, and they're years ahead of us. But that, from a business point of view, that's exciting because it shows us where we can go with all of this. They've already got there, and they get it, and they just see it as like, this is a no-brainer. This is just a really useful form of transport. So the exciting thing is, I think we're going to go there, and all the stuff we talked about earlier on about government policy plays into this. There are points of resistance, and there's still stuff to overcome. But it feels to me like there's a degree of inevitability about this. This is such a no-brainer; it's going to happen. I'll pass over to Rachel.
And Rachel, from a research point of view and from a behavioural change point of view, what insights have you picked up on this topic?
First of all, just a point about, getting more people cycling. We also need to think about maintaining cycling, because at the moment we have this massive drop off for cycling as people get older, and that is not the case in high cycling countries. Women in age 65 in the Netherlands make 1 in 4 of their trips by bike, whereas here the amount of trips, it's tiny, it's less than 1%. So, we need to think about the role of e-bikes and allowing people to continue cycling, continue making trips, and otherwise they might have stopped. And I think that is also really important. But e-bikes could be a game changer in many parts of the country. So when I've been part of the team developing the propensity to cycle tool for the Department for Transport, which looks at cycling potential for school trips and for commute trips. If in England and Wales people cycle to work at the same rates as the Dutch do by distance and hilliness, instead of 3%, we'd have 20% cycling to work. So clearly, the hills are not the main thing. There are lots of other things, including infrastructure, importantly, that mean that we're at 3% instead of 20%. But you then get an extra 6 or 7% when you add in the potential for e-bikes and assume that people have access to e-bikes for longer and hillier trips. And if you look specifically at places like Devon and Cornwall, it makes a massive difference, because those trips are just that bit too long, that bit too hilly for your average person to cycle, even when you've got Dutch style conditions. Those trips start switching when you add e-bikes into the mix. So it could be, I would say the precondition is getting that infrastructure, getting that policy right and so on. But if we have that, then the contribution of e-bikes in a country like England could be really substantial in those more, hillier, more dispersed areas.
Thank you. I'm going to change the subject slightly and move across to you, Sarah. So I've got a question around with the fact that we've now got a handful of very active travel commissioners for city regions across the country. And I guess there's a question there around coordination and how much you are able to work together. Are you largely independent of each other? Are there other communities of practice required to learn from each other? So how's that working out as far as the other regions are concerned?
Yeah, so we have the Commissioners Group, which is made up of the commissioners across the UK. So we have the Active Nation Commissioner in Scotland, Lee Craigie, who's a former professional mountain biker. Obviously, Chris Boardman in Greater Manchester, Simon O'Brien of Brookside fame, I think it is, in Liverpool City region, Will Norman down in London, and then myself in Sheffield City region. We also have the active travel champion from the Welsh side of things, who comes to the meetings and contributes. And we try and meet 4 or 5 times a year, or whenever one of us believes there to be a piece of work that's really important for collaboration on. And at the moment, we are collaborating quite closely because of the messaging needed around the active neighbourhoods. And we've chosen to go with the term active neighbourhood because low traffic neighbourhood kind of depicts that negative side. And actually traffic isn't just vehicle traffic, it's all traffic, people walking, cycling, scooting, any kind of traffic. So we're trying to make that distinction between vehicle traffic and just traffic, people moving about. So we've started to call them active neighbourhoods for that reason, to try and promote that positive mindset around it. And we are working closely together. And we wrote to the Department of Transport when I was first appointed in June of 2019. We had our first commissioners event, and we put across 5 things that we would like them to gift us in order for them to make our lives easier. And some of those have come through with the gear change document, the LTM 120, but there are other areas that we could work on around traffic fines and the ability to utilise traffic cameras and things to enforce school streets outside of London, and other infrastructure that needs doing. And also, if we can enforce things, we won't need any of those A-frame and closed barriers that are so inaccessible to disabled people. So we do work together, and I think it's incredibly good to have that collaboration and to bounce ideas, and also to help each other with our different strengths. And to make sure that we can help across the UK. And hopefully when Active Travel England comes in place, that will give us another layer of support in order to help, so that when you go from region to region, you can expect to see the same level of infrastructure, and you'll know that you're going to be safe. And on top of that is the idea of addressing driver behaviour, because it's so important that road safety isn't just down to the way that we produce infrastructure. It's also about the way people interact with each other on the public highway, and drivers have a huge responsibility to all types of vulnerable road users, whether that's looking out for children trying to cross the road, whether that's the way that they drive around horses, or the way that they perceive a group of people who are riding their bikes.
And I guess, there are going to be cultural and geographical difference. You're talking of, the strengths that you might be able to offer to each other. There are differences, of course, culturally and geographically, and I'm sure, socially and economically, there are differences across the country and across the nations. You talked about Scotland and Wales there as well. Is that taken into account during those discussions? And what have you learned from any of those discussions?
Well, we do. We share the ins and outs of things that are happening, the progress that we're making in different areas. So where you have a particularly rural location and someone, another part of the UK is looking at the rural situation, or different types of towns and cities, each of our regions is made up incredibly differently. So that the blueprint won't look the same everywhere, but the general principles of delivering high quality infrastructure, of winning that political will, of building that ambition, with all stakeholders across each region and across each town and city, and of engaging with the different types of political leadership, because we're non-political appointments. So we work with everybody to try and make sure that it's something that can be, of benefit to all, and also bringing together the different stakeholders that have, a hand in this, because it's it's huge on the health agenda as well. It has a massive impact on our ability to build resilience into the population, to build productivity into the workforce. And so we do have a role to play in supporting each other to build that. I have obviously a strength in disabled travel, disabled access, and that's something that I frequently share with my counterparts, to make sure that, if we're looking at nationwide opportunities for people who have access needs and disabilities, that we can make sure that we present that to each part of the country as best as we can.
Great, thank you. And I guess building on that, maybe a question for yourself and Rachel here, on what more can be done to enable active travel to work in combination with public transport as well. So presumably in your discussions within the city, within the region, there are demands on spending, and there are demands on time and availability of really valuable resources to get things right for everybody to travel well around the cities. And how do you manage to do that in conjunction with those who want to provide suitable public transport as well?
You've got the local area where the bus services, enabling people to walk to their bus stop, so that they can catch a bus. We know that active travellers have got a higher propensity to use public transport, because once you jump in the car, the chances are you're just going to go the whole journey in that car, or you're going to need to fight for a parking space at the train station, which then leads to them giving up and using the vehicle the whole journey. But there's also that across the north. So I work with Transport for the North, and making sure that we put across the importance of active travel for pushing the passengers towards that rail network, and giving the people the opportunity to travel longer distances without the need for a car, which then frees up road space for utilising the strategic road network for delivering the goods and services that can't be delivered any other way. So that it is just tying all together. And so it's about making sure that we provide for the beginning and the end of somebody's journey, with the bit in the middle being on public transport, whether that's a more local journey on a bus, a tram, or whether that's a much longer journey on the train network.
And Rachel, how does that link to your research?
Yeah, I mean, the potential for more cycling to train stations is something we've investigated a little bit and found that is really substantial. But when you look at many sort of train stations where people are doing longer trips that wouldn't easily be switched to cycling and walking in themselves, and yet they're driving to the train station, it's literally 2 miles. Then you look at the route and you think, well, yeah, if I had the choice and that was me, I would drive to the train station, because it's just horrible. And even for walking journeys, which are less likely to be absolutely blocked for so many people, they're often very off-putting. Getting to a train station, getting to a bus station can often involve subways, long staggered crossings and so on. We need to make this much more easy and much more seamless. And another thing I just say sometimes we see the sustainable modes kind of being in conflict a little bit, and I think absolutely not, because one of the things we maybe don't think about always with multimodality is that people and perhaps travel surveys perhaps reinforce that, because we look at 1 day or 1 week of someone's traveling, but many people change how they travel across the course of a year, different times of the year, different times of day, and so on. So somebody who uses public transport one time can also potentially make the same trip by active travel another time. And one of the things that I think has supported the rise in active travel in London has been the fact that public transport is relatively good, and the fact that people, as Sarah said, you know, if they're already multimodal, potentially it's easier for them to take up, you know, walking, cycling or public transport if they're already not just jumping in the car the whole time. So we need people to have a whole range of options. They need to have the option of the bus, they need to have the option of cycling, they need to have the option of walking, and then they can choose between them, and then not having a car becomes, you know, an opportunity rather than a problem.
Fascinating, thank you. I'm going to move across to a question that's come in, and by the way, I would encourage attendees to pose questions that they might have, especially based on the conversation that's already taken place. If there's things that you want to try and get answers from the panelists on. The first question that's come in is from Baz, which says, "Hi folks, this is a fascinating discussion." So that's a good start. In your view, is there enough data available in order to make evidence-based decisions relating to active travel infrastructure? Can local authorities make more data available? What other data would be of value to make it work across the nation or even locally? Should the provision of data be mandated? If you had a magic wand, what kind of data could provide you with some immediate value? Apologies, there's a fair amount to unpack there. And indeed there is. But I guess, you know, data is actually key here. Whether that's data that, you know, helps us understand what infrastructure could look like, or whether it's data that we can like immediately get from you know, live data, from tracking data, or whatever it might be. But I guess there's quite a broad question there. Tom, I'm going to come to you in terms of the way that you use data and the way that you think data, or what does data mean to your organization?
Thanks, Neil. So we're doing quite a lot of research around consumer expectations and needs. That's kind of an ongoing piece at the moment. I'm kind of interested in things like, you know, Strava Metro and how you can use that kind of tool to analyze journey habits. I mean, that tells you some stuff. It doesn't tell you what it doesn't tell you, kind of thing. So it'll tell you what people are doing. It doesn't necessarily tell you what they could be doing. So I think there's more to do there. So something else I've been looking at, I mean, it's kind of data. It also harks back a little bit to the subject we were just touching on, is that intermodal travel question and the shortcomings currently of public transport capacity to accommodate, how hard it is to take a bike on a train, for example, right now. And you know, it's kind of okay sometimes if you want to cycle to a station. But then stitching the journey together, if you you know, and I speak from personal experience, you know, if you want to get from a mainline station to another mainline station and then continue your journey to the other end, getting your bike on the train is still a bit of a problem. So we're not quite joining up all the dots yet on that kind of stuff. So I mean, that's a bit of a data thing, but it's also a bit of a connectivity thing. So we look at the data from a consumer point of view primarily. You know, what do they need? What do they want? Whereas I'm sure Rachel looks at it from a more of a, I guess more from an infrastructure point of view, maybe. I don't know.
Well, let's hear from Rachel.
Yeah, I was just typing away furiously because there's so many good questions there, and I think we could have a day-long event on those questions, but I should try and be really brief and just say a few things that I think might be of interest. So one of the things I think it's important to understand is the difference between monitoring and evaluation, and both are really important. So local authorities should do and do monitoring in terms of they put a scheme in, hopefully they look at, for instance, the impact on bus journey times. They might want to tweak something to make sure bus journey times not impacted. However, you know, the bus journey time change may not be due due to the scheme. The scheme may be improving things, but other factors may be making them worse again. So being able to tease out those factors and saying, in general, putting this kind of infrastructure in has this kind of an effect, like more of an evaluation approach, separating things out and looking at being able to take away the background trends, being able to take away the other factors is so important, and means it's so important for future decision making. And it doesn't necessarily mean that every scheme of that type will be a success, but it does mean that if we put in low traffic neighbourhoods, we are likely to see this type of an increase in walking, cycling, this type of reduction in car use, and so on. And so the evaluation side of things is crucial, but it's not necessarily, and understandably, it's not what local authorities are necessarily thinking of as they put a scheme in. So that's why, you know, being in touch with academics and sort of thinking about these things together is important. I wanted to mention that there is some work already on the impacts of different measures. So Lynn Sloman and her colleagues at Transport for Quality of Life have done some really important work for Department for Transport, where they've sort of estimated the impact that you might get from putting in cycle lanes in terms of additional levels of cycling. So there is some of that work already out there. It's estimates, but it's quite helpful and useful. A third point I wanted to make was around data sharing and standardization. So one of the problems we often have, academics, you know, we love using existing data. I do, you know, it's already out there, it's free, you can just get it. And the census has been used so many times for so many things. And that's because it's a national data set, it's everybody, it's standardized. And, you know, the problem that we often have is that there's 300 odd local authorities, they collect data completely differently, they're all in different places. And I would like to see actually DFT take more of a lead on this, because it's even a problem in London with the boroughs, and collating information on low traffic neighbourhoods across London that went in over 6 months proved to be a much bigger task than I thought it might be. So it's, you know, getting that data standardised and shared. And just one final thing, we need data champions, because we often lose data for no particular reason and it's really hard to get it back. So in 2010, there was a decision made to take out a question on travel to school from the annual schools monitoring, the school travel census it was called, but literally it was just asking children how they travel to school usually. And the loss of that question has been devastating in terms of being able to look at school cycling potential after that point, because you don't have the data. It was data like the census in terms of having origins and destinations and being able to see how children travelled for different journey lengths. And obviously for Department for Education, that wasn't crucial to them, and they thought, why are we asking this question? And it just gets taken out and it's really hard to get back again. So I think kind of an integrated view, because a lot of data that's critical for transport is not necessarily collected for transport purposes. So we need to keep an eye on that data and not let it just disappear because somebody thinks, oh, that's not really that important.
Wow, truly fascinating. Again, thanks, Rachel. So Sarah, same question to you around data. What does it mean to, you know, what does it mean to the Sheffield region, and how have you used it to direct what you're doing?
Well, as Rachel said, monitoring and evaluation is absolutely key, and we'll be getting some reports on that from 2021 with the schemes that we're having, and I think Rachel's probably involved with some of that for us. But one of the things that we're missing in a data set is being able to monitor and know the number of pedestrians that are out there and the number of journeys to work that are done by specifically different active means. For example, running to work. When we were in the office and not at home, we had a number of colleagues who would run to work because they'd used the bus or their own private vehicle and actually realised if they ran, they could run past the queue because the buses were stuck in that queue as well. And so how many people do run their journeys? And that's something that's very difficult. And you've got to be careful where you take your data from, because we got some data from a mapping tool which suggested that at one week that the number of journeys walked was absolutely skyrocketing, and then the following week there was absolutely none. But once you've learnt your route walking, it's unlikely that you're going to be, well, you might still be looking at your phone, but you won't be looking at the navigation tool. So taking the data from reliable sources and being able to extrapolate what you need is really, really important. So people like Rachel are incredibly valuable to us, because as she says, being able to work with the academics and unravel it in a way that can be credible is vital for us to build the business cases to be able to put in successful schemes elsewhere.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to move to another question, which it's from Neil, and it says, I'll pose a shorter question. I'm not sure the shorter question necessarily means a shorter answer here in this instance, though, because in terms of active travel uptake, have we passed the tipping point? Tom, any thoughts on this?
It was just painful watching the data, the weekly data from the DFT around transport modal use through the summer. You know, there was this really exciting moment around sort of May, June time when cycling was up around 300 or 400% of pre-lockdown levels, and you're going, wow, this is great. And, you know, car use had collapsed. And where are we now? Cycling's kind of roughly back to 100%, so it's back to normal, roughly. Car use is also roughly back to where we were before. The bit we've lost still for now is the public transport usage, particularly London Underground, but also buses and trains that are below 50% usage. So we've already lost quite a lot of ground that we gained through the summer. And okay, like it's nice today, but mostly it's cold and grey and dark out there now, and that kind of discourages people from active travel. So it was exciting, and then it was a little bit depressing, but actually I think a lot that has happened this year is permanently changing how we behave. And I think it will take time to play through, but it is going to play through. And all the hard yards people like Sarah are doing regionally around the country, and all the work Rachel's doing, you know, all this really good analysis and data stuff, you know, it is going to bear fruit. It's just going to take time, I think. And as the infrastructure improves, as the government support improves, and at a local level, you know, local councillors, local boroughs start doing the right thing, you know, come back in 5 or 10 years' time, and I think we will have moved a very long way, I think.
I knew it wasn't going to be a short answer. Has it passed the tipping point, yes or no? Over to you, Rachel. Any thoughts on whether we've passed a tipping point, whatever that really means as well, and however you want to interpret that?
I mean, I guess for me, it's about things just happening. It's about not having someone who's really passionate about walking or cycling or active travel, or, you know, to you know, having to have that person for things to change. And so many people, you know, we all know so many people who've just gone above and beyond, and who just stay in the office, and when you're in the office, stay in the office virtually, maybe, you know, in the evening, at the weekend, to make things happen. And that shouldn't have to happen. It should just happen. There should, you know, if you have people who don't particularly like walking, that shouldn't matter. You should still get great walking infrastructure built. And it's kind of getting it mainstream so that we don't have to have people who are passionate for things to change. Things just get built. It's just mainstream. You just put in that infrastructure. You just do those things because that's what you do. And I think we're still quite a long way away from there. We still see so many examples of where there's somebody in post, you know, there's a transport portfolio holder in a council, and they're really passionate and about walking, cycling. They make things happen, and then they go, and everything just falls apart. And we still have too much of that. So it's when it gets into that mainstream, and I don't think we're there yet. Thank
you. And Sarah?
No, we're still climbing the mountain. We've still got a long way to go, but I think that's, you know, that's fine. We see so easily how people will jump back into their vehicles. It's still the easy option. It's still very much prioritized. It's still the most convenient for the vast majority of people. And until we have suitable infrastructure, a different mindset as to, you know, whether or not it feels safe on the road as well, then we're a long way away from that. So, and also the number of children who can, you know, independently cycle or walk to school, we're a long way away from some of our European neighbours on that. And I think that's something that we could work on as a, not necessarily a quick win, but it would be quicker to achieve that if we tackled some of the obstacles. And it seems to be very unlikely that people will tackle head-on driver behaviour and actually say to people who are behind the wheel of a metal box that can do so much harm, it is in your hands how safe our streets are.
Thank you. There's another question that's come in, which is specifically for you, Tom. What does the future look like for e-bike fleets and the connections to infrastructure through IoT? From Christoph.
Yeah, thanks, Christoph. I think we're just at the front edge of this. So we're running trials with delivery companies. As a business, we've only started doing that this year. So I think I can't speak at length on this. I think there are some really interesting opportunities in terms of how we can use the internet and use connectivity across businesses. So when you think about cargo bikes with multiple loads and how we communicate and how we achieve efficiencies in how we manage those fleets, I think there are some fantastic opportunities there, but I cannot say much more on the subject because we've only just started doing that in our business.
Thank you. There's one question that's come in one of the most common and difficult challenges as a highways engineer is designing for all modes of transport, I'm sure, and ensuring safety for each highway user in urban environments with historically restricted widths on the main routes, with terraced housing either side of the carriageway, for example. What advice? I think, you know, we have to respect the fact that that must be an incredible challenge for the engineers. What advice do our panelists have for designers coming up against this frequent challenge? Sarah, any thoughts from you on this?
We have created a design panel to make sure that we can kind of put across the different challenges and come to a general consensus. But I think on the whole, it's about prioritising people and their experience of that street. And, you know, if we have to have parked vehicles on the pavement in order to make sure there's access for emergency vehicles, what does that say for the people who are trying to walk along that street? And where are the priorities? And that's why we need to build more active neighbourhoods to make it less likely that people are going to need a vehicle in the first place, especially if they live in a place where it's less likely that they're going to be able to store it. And a colleague of mine pointed out that vehicles seem to be the only piece of personal property that it's acceptable to store on a public place. If you were to leave your sofa on the street, someone would come and tell you off fairly quickly. So when we start to look at personal property in a different way, and it's not an entitlement that should be stored in a public place, and that changes the discussion point a little bit. It doesn't make it any less easy, it just changes the emphasis on how we look for those solutions.
Okay, and Rachel, any thoughts from you on that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe looking at what they've done in Waltham Forest provides some nice examples, because, you know, you can see really high spec infrastructure in London, like along the embankment, but obviously they had quite a lot of space to play with there. They don't have junctions and so on. But if you go to Waltham Forest and see what they've done along some of the main roads, I think that's really inspiring, because it deals with situations like that where space is constrained, where you are you're maintaining motor traffic flow, but you're trying to provide more space for walking and cycling and improve the walking and cycling environment. And, you know, you look at it and sometimes you think, yeah, the footway is not as wide as I'd like, the cycle track is not as wide as I'd like, but they've taken away car parking. Basically, they've made decisions about carriageway width, and they've done, you know, given the constraints, they've done pretty well, I think. And I would be prepared to cycle along it on places that I wouldn't be prepared to cycle along before. They've created what is, you know, functional infrastructure. So there are examples. You know, it doesn't look as amazing as where you've got infinite space to play with, but it does, you know, it is functional.
So we've got a fascinating question coming in, which I can only point, I think, at you, Rachel, on this one. Expressed and self-reported behavioural and preference data, especially if it's one-off or short-term, is of far lower reliability and thus analytical usefulness than that of actual behaviour and that's done long-term. Yet, as a social scientist, I still see too many projects gathering and relying on the former. Is that because it's easier? And what would you suggest doing about it?
Okay, I'll try and provide some thoughts. I mean, preference data, I think, is useful in learning about what people would like to see. It's not necessarily that useful in saying, okay, if we did this, people would change their behaviour in this precise way. I think you have to understand the limitations of the data. I mean, all data, the data that we may use, for instance, from apps such as Strava, is data on where people have actually gone, but it has its own limitations in terms of coverage and so on. There are always trade-offs of cost, you know, scope, who will be included and so on. I think, you know, for instance, when you're talking about travel diaries where people are asked to report trips over a day or a week, these are reasonably reliable. I don't think they're that bad. So there's always a trade-off. I think there is a tradition, actually, when I did a systematic review looking at some state of preference studies, and I was looking at the composition of the groups in that, and many of the groups were actually groups of 18 young men, and the reason for this was that they were professors doing those studies who had done those studies on the group that were in their class. So there is a bit of a tradition of that kind of thing, but I don't know, I think there's trade-offs between different data sources, and as long as you understand the limitation of what your data can show you, which, e.g. that your preference study is not telling you that this many people would definitely do that if you did X, then, you know, preference studies have a role in saying what people prefer.
There you go, Brendan. I hope that answers your question. I'm going to move across to a question from Zena that's come in, and I'm going to go to Tom, I think, with this. Are there any data or evidence of this safety increase for cyclists using LiDAR, and actually whether or not you as a company have explored using other technologies like that within the bikes that you might want to sell in the future, or whether that's anything you've researched?
And this is going to be a short answer because I'm not familiar with LiDAR, unfortunately. If anyone else on this panel can come in here, I'd be grateful.
LiDAR
I apologize for that.
Is light emitting radar effectively. So it's what autonomous vehicles use to gauge their world. And there's a question for whether cyclists could use it.
A really interesting question. I think it sounds kind of. I think there's a lot of downward pressure on pricing on bikes and electric bikes. I'd be interested to look at the costs of that and how feasible it would be to incorporate that kind of technology into what are essentially pretty lightweight, low impact vehicles. I think, look, Holland's managed to find an answer that doesn't need it. And I think if you get the infrastructure right, ideally you don't need that. And the point was made earlier on. It shouldn't be the cyclist's responsibility to look after their own safety. If someone's driving a ton of metal, it's their responsibility to look out for you, not the other way around. So, that's where I'd start with that.
I'll move on to another question from Steve. So I think this here in Southampton, we have a long-term transport strategy to relocate road space from cars to public transport, walking and cycling. This is fine, but when schemes start to be installed, a loud minority campaign against this. Do you think the fact that local council have elections every year, I think is corrected that in the next question, make it difficult for local councillors to look long term? And Sarah, I'm going to come back to you with that particular question.
Yeah, it's definitely a problem if it's being used as a reason to vote or not to vote for somebody. And that's one of the reasons why we need to try and get around it being, something that people can use as political chippings, if you like. We need it to be a cross-party consensus that this is the best thing for the future health of our nation, apart from anything else. But it's also going to be that collective goal towards addressing pollution and air quality, towards decarbonising our economy and our environment, making sure that the future is more sustainable for everybody, and that should be everybody's goal, regardless of the colour of their politics. So I think if we can get more consensus across different political parties and make it easier for people to choose their leaders, not just because of whether or not they're supporting a motor vehicle lobby, and it is a loud minority, but it often gets a lot of support from press, because they're funded through being able to create clicks on articles, and that means that it's something that people will click through to discuss. And there's lots of myths that build around that as well. So it does make it incredibly challenging, and that's one of the reasons why we need long-term sustained funding as well, which hasn't happened this year. But we need to be able to look and create strategies that are funded suitably, so that things are committed and then they're followed through with. And I always kind of draw the analogy to elite sport, because we had a very piecemeal approach to funding elite sport, but John Major came up with the idea of the funding programme that we have today, and Tony Blair's government implemented it, and it's still around 26 years later. And it's an incredibly effective way of ensuring that we have high quality, high standards all of the time. So I'm really keen to find a solution to it being a piecemeal because of who's elected and when.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time. I think we're coming towards the end of the session. There is one fascinating question that's come in, and I'm going to hand it to you, Tom, on the subject of Chinese manufactured goods. Should Brexit Britain remove the anti-dumping tax on Chinese manufactured goods to boost budget e-bike sales?
I think it's a really interesting question. Pretty much all the bikes in the world are made in the Far East. I mean, that's a bit of a generalization, but most of them, China, Taiwan, bikes, e-bikes, electric scooters, they're all manufactured over there right now. I'm going to duck the tax question, by the way, because I think the interesting challenge for the UK right now, and again, I'm not going to get into Brexit either. It's a thing, it's happening. We're doing some of the engineering in this country. It would be fantastic if over time we could build an ecosystem of suppliers and parts and get to a point, and it will take time, where we're actually making more of this stuff over here and doing it. It's just not economic to do it right now. We've looked hard at it. It would be great to bring some of that stuff on shore, and it will take time. And I think that would be a really exciting goal to work towards.
And I think, if I might add, in fact, to this part of the conversation, the role of the Connected Places Catapult is to grow UK businesses and to break down the barriers to allow them to grow as well. So when we're having these discussions with organisations, you're right, the supply chain within active travel in the UK is not significant. However, the opportunities for UK businesses in terms of the overall deployment of some of the infrastructure that we've been talking about, the amount of research that needs to be done to allow all of this to happen, really is significant. And that's one of the things that we're trying to focus on. So using pretty advanced techniques, gathering innovative data streams to help and inform the way that the infrastructure needs to be deployed is definitely something that we're going to be focusing on going forwards. So my last couple of questions as we bring the session to an end really are from each of you, I think, which is to say, if you were to look forward, what would success for you in this particular area, active travel and net zero, what would success look like for you in a year, in 2 years, in the foreseeable future? And I'm going to come to you firstly, Rachel.
Well, maybe just to follow on from something that Tom said earlier, which is that the investment in active travel needs a zero on it. We need to be spending a lot more on active travel, and we need to be spending a lot less on cars and building new roads. I mean, we really need a shift away from that. If the green revolution and so on is serious, then that really needs to change.
Thank you. And Tom?
So the government says it wants to double the amount of cycling. People take on average about 1,000 journeys a year, walking, train, cycling, driving, whatever. And of those 1,000 journeys we all take on average every year, about 17 currently are cycling. So when the government says it wants to double the amount of cycling going on in this country, that looks to me like a pretty modest ambition. You go back to the 1950s, people were cycling hundreds of miles every year. And I'm not suggesting we all have to be doing that, but we could get to a point where 30, 40, 50% of journeys in at least in an urban environment, and maybe in some rural context as well, would be active or shared transport. That's the kind of scale we need to be looking at. So I'm not putting a hard number on it, but that's where we need to be aiming for, big numbers.
Some real ambition by the sounds of things. And over to you, Sarah.
Well, I'd like to see a natural move towards creating really high quality infrastructure without having to kind of keep banging on about it. So all of those things that we know need to happen, and we keep having to remind people: accessibility, people who are using non-standard bikes with 3 wheels, 4 wheels, cargo bikes, double buggies, triple buggies, buggies with extra layers because you've got multiple berth, all these different types of machines that are currently hidden and not seen unless you suddenly absorb yourself in that world and realize how many of them there are. So infrastructure that naturally caters for all of those different types of people without us having to keep using our energy to bang on about it. But also where we get to a point where it's the natural choice to walk or cycle for that short journey. So when people leave their house, they have the opportunity to walk to their local shops, to go and pick up the meat from the butcher, the greengrocers, to go and pick up the paper, to collect the prescription, to visit the local opticians, doctors, vets, without having to jump in their car for all of those short journeys. And if we can change the way people look at how they move around and get people to naturally choose to be active, then we will also have a massive impact on the health of our people, provide more opportunities for people to access employment. It shouldn't be a prerequisite that you have a vehicle in order to access employment and education. You should be able to get there regardless of that. So making those short journeys the natural choice to be on foot or by bike, that would be success. And whether that takes 5 years or 10 years, I think it's absolutely possible, because that's what children tell us they enjoy doing. They enjoy walking to school, they enjoy scooting to school, but then something happens and they don't do it when they move into adulthood, and we need to change that.
I would love to think in 5 years' time we could run another webinar that talks about the successes that we've had, and I really hope we can. And I think, with the combined activity that's going on in this field, I think it certainly is possible. From my point of view, I just really wanted to say a big thank you to the incredible speakers that we've had today and their insights and the information that we've been provided. As we've said, this has been recorded, so please feel free to send the link out to colleagues who might benefit from this, or people that you are that would benefit from in other organizations as well. I did want to mention just one other point, that the third Thursday session will be taking a break for over the Christmas period, and it will return next year. So please check out our events page for upcoming events. There's some that we've just highlighted here on the slide in November and into December. But I guess that's all from me. I'm really sorry